Welcome to a city that stank, dazzled, and roared all at once. This is London, not the London of red buses and Buckingham Palace. This is the London of 1660, a city clawing itself back from the edge of collapse, drunk on its own survival, and about to be tested again in the most devastating way imaginable. Before it became the capital of an empire, before it became the financial center of the world, London in the 1660s was something far more raw, far more human, and far more dangerous. It was a city of 400,000 souls crammed into medieval streets barely wider than your outstretched arms. A city where kings returned from exile, where plague walked openly through the markets, and where a single bakery on Pudding Lane would change urban history forever. Today, you won't just hear about London, you will smell its river, you will feel the mud beneath your feet, you will stand in its taverns, its plague pits, and its royal courts, and you will watch it burn. But before the fire, there is the city. And this city, in the 1660s, was one of the most extraordinary places on earth. Let us begin. To understand London in the 1660s, you must understand what happened in May 1660, because this city was not just a place. In this decade, it was a mood, and that mood was euphoria mixed with paranoia. For 11 years, England had lived under the Puritan rule of Oliver Cromwell. The theaters were shut, Christmas was banned, dancing in public was illegal. The maypoles that had stood in every village green for centuries were torn down. Even excessive laughter was considered a sin. London, a city that had always loved noise and spectacle and excess, had been forced into a grey, joyless silence. Then, on the 29th of May 1660, King Charles II rode into London, and the city lost its mind. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of almost delirious joy. People lined the streets 10 deep, throwing flowers from windows. Church bells rang for hours without stopping. Bonfires blazed on every corner. Samuel Pepys, a young naval clerk who would become our greatest guide to this decade, wrote in his diary that the shouting and joy expressed by all was past imagination. Pepys himself was so overcome he had to stop and weep in the street. This is the London we are entering, a city that had been starved of pleasure and was now consuming it with the desperation of someone breaking a long fast. This is the context for everything you are about to see. The theaters that reopened, the fashions that became outrageous, the coffee houses that never closed, the bawdy, brilliant, dangerous energy of a city released from a decade of enforced piety. And at the center of all of it, a king who understood better than almost any monarch in history that spectacle was power. Every great city of this era had a river at its heart. But the Thames was something different. It was not just a highway or a boundary, it was London's entire circulatory system. Stand on the riverbank in 1660 and look east. What you see is one of the most astonishing sights in the world. This single stretch of water handles more commercial traffic than any other port in Europe. Thousands of vessels, from massive Dutch merchant flights to tiny Thames wherries, jostle for space between the narrow stone arches of London Bridge. The noise is overwhelming. The creak of timber, the shouts of watermen, the splash of oars, and beneath it all, the low, churning groan of the tidal river itself. The Thames was London's front door, its food market, its highway, and its rubbish dump, all at the same time. On any given morning, the river delivered coal from Newcastle to heat the city's homes, grain from East Anglia to feed its population, wine from France and Portugal to fill its taverns, and silk and spices from the East India Company's ships arriving from the other side of the world. In the 1660s, London was handling roughly 80% of all English trade. That number alone tells you why every major European power, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, watched the city with a mixture of envy and dread. But the Thames had a darker identity too. It was the city's sewer. Every morning across London, the contents of chamber pots were emptied into channels that ran down the cobbled streets and drained directly into the river. Fish sellers worked feet from slaughterhouse waste. Tanneries dumped their chemicals upstream of the water conduits that supplied the city's drinking water. The smell, particularly in summer, was described by visitors as a physical blow, something you felt rather than simply inhaled. And yet, the Thames was also the city's greatest source of wonder. In the winter of 1663, it froze completely solid. Londoners walked out onto the ice and held a frost fair, a temporary city built on the river itself. Pepys records buying oranges and walking between rows of stalls, selling roasted ox, hot wine, and gingerbread. Coaches drove across it. Puppet shows were performed on it. A printing press was set up, and people paid to have their name printed on a certificate that read, "Printed on the River Thames during the Great Frost." This was London's genius. It could turn even a catastrophe into a spectacle. Step away from the river and walk into the city proper, and you step into a different world entirely. London in the 1660s was overwhelmingly medieval. Its street plan had not changed significantly since the 13th century. Its buildings, the vast majority of them, were timber frame structures with upper floors that jutted out over the street with each successive story, so that two buildings facing each other on a narrow alley would almost touch at their rooftops, blotting out the sky. These streets had names that told you exactly what happened in them: Bread Street, Milk Street, Poultry, Fish Street, Ironmonger Lane. This was a city where every trade had its territory and every territory had its sounds and smells. Walk down Cheapside, the great commercial artery of the medieval city, and you are assaulted from every direction. Street vendors cry their goods in a rising melodic call that was so distinctive it became a musical genre, the London Cries, transcribed by composers. An apprentice boy shouts from the doorway of a draper's shop. A water carrier with two enormous pails balanced across his shoulders pushes through the crowd. A sedan chair, the 17th century equivalent of a taxi, forces pedestrians against the walls, and underneath everything, running in an open channel down the center of the road, is the kennel, the gutter, carrying a dark stream of mixed waste toward the river. London had no street lighting. After dark, the city transformed into something close to a medieval nightmare. Wealthy Londoners hired link boys, young boys who ran ahead of them carrying flaming torches to light the way. Everyone else navigated by moonlight and instinct. Pickpockets and muggers, called footpads, worked the dark alleys. The Watch, London's primitive police force, was famously corrupt and frequently drunk. The sensible Londoner was indoors by 9, yet the streets were also where London was most alive. This was a city of performers. Acrobats worked the crowds at Smithfield Market. Fortune tellers operated near the Royal Exchange. Dancing bears were a common sight near the South Bank. And threading through all of it were the news sellers, shouting the latest broadsheets and pamphlets, the 17th century's version of social media, spreading gossip, political scandal, and outright fabrication in equal measure. But beneath the chaos of the streets, London in the 1660s was operating a sophisticated economic machine. To understand why this city was the most important in the English-speaking world, and why its destruction would send shockwaves across an entire civilization, you must understand the 5 great engines that drove it. The first was the Royal Exchange, the beating financial heart of the city. Built originally in the 1560s, by the merchant Sir Thomas Gresham, by the 1660s, it was the center of international commerce in Northern Europe. Merchants from Amsterdam, Hamburg, Venice, and Antwerp met here twice daily beneath the stone arcades to negotiate deals involving tobacco from Virginia, sugar from Barbados, cloth from the English Midlands, and silver from Peru. If you wanted to understand the price of anything in the world, you came to the Royal Exchange. The second engine was the East India Company, one of the most extraordinary and terrifying institutions in human history. Headquartered in London, it was by the 1660s already more than just a trading company. It had its own army, its own courts, its own flag. It controlled access to pepper, cotton, indigo, and saltpeter from the Indian subcontinent, and maintained a network of fortified trading posts, stretching from Bombay to Bantam. The wealth it pumped into London was staggering. The profits from a single successful voyage could make a merchant's entire family wealthy for 3 generations. The third pillar was the cloth trade, the ancient foundation of English wealth. The wool and woolen cloth produced in England was the finest in the world. It flowed out through London's docks to customers across Europe, funding not just merchants but a vast network of weavers, dyers, fullers, and factors across the English countryside. When economists of the 17th century tried to explain England's wealth, they almost always started here. The fourth engine, and the one changing the city's social landscape in real time, was the coffee house. The first London coffee house opened in 1652. By 1663, there were already over 80 of them. By the end of the decade, there would be hundreds. For the price of 1 penny, the entry fee that earned them the nickname penny universities, any man could sit for hours, read the newspapers and pamphlets laid out on the tables, and join conversations about politics, science, trade, and philosophy. Lloyd's Coffee House on Tower Street would become the world's greatest insurance market. Jonathan's Coffee House in Change Alley would evolve into the London Stock Exchange. The ideas that circulated in these rooms shaped the modern world. The fifth pillar was the Royal Navy, and behind it, the entire apparatus of English maritime power. In the 1660s, England was fighting the Second Anglo-Dutch War, a brutal naval conflict over control of global trade routes. Samuel Pepys, our diarist, spent these years at the Navy Board working 18-hour days to keep English warships funded and provisioned. The outcome of this war would determine whether London or Amsterdam would become the dominant trading city of the Atlantic world. The stakes, in other words, could not have been higher. Now climb out of the commercial city and travel west, because in the 1660s, London was really 2 cities separated by a mile of fields and villages. To the east was the City of London, the merchant city, medieval and Protestant and obsessed with money. To the west was Westminster, the royal city, Catholic in sympathy, European in culture and obsessed with the king. And what a king to be obsessed with. Charles II was tall, 6 feet 2 inches, extraordinary for the era, dark complexioned, famously charming, and constitutionally incapable of fidelity. He had spent his exile in the courts of France and the Spanish Netherlands, and he had absorbed their culture deeply. He returned to England not as a Puritan king, but as a thoroughly European one. He brought French fashions, French music, French cuisine, and a sensibility toward pleasure that horrified the older generation and electrified the young. The court at Whitehall Palace under Charles II was one of the most glamorous and most debauched in Europe. The palace itself was enormous, a rambling complex of over 1,500 rooms spread along the bank of the Thames between Westminster and the city. It had its own tennis courts, a cockpit for cockfighting, bowling greens, and a great hall where theatrical performances were staged regularly. Charles had a passion for science and established the Royal Society, the world's first national scientific academy, granting it a royal charter in 1662. Its members in this decade included Christopher Wren, Robert Boyle, Robert Hooke, and Isaac Newton, a club of perhaps 40 men who were, between them, in the process of inventing the modern world. But Whitehall was also a place of intense political danger. Charles had returned to power with no fixed income, dependent on a parliament that remembered his father's execution and was determined never to allow a king that much power again. The court was a battleground of factions, royalists versus parliamentarians, Catholics versus Protestants, pro-French versus pro-Dutch. Every appointment, every royal favor, every whispered conversation in the long gallery was a political act. To be at court was to be permanently on stage, performing loyalty, and performing something else entirely after dark. Charles had at least a dozen acknowledged mistresses during his reign, most famously the actress Nell Gwyn, a woman who had risen from selling oranges in the theater pit to sleeping in the royal bedchamber. His court was saturated with what his contemporaries called wit, a fast, cynical, sexually charged form of humor that found its expression in the Restoration comedies performed at the newly reopened theaters. For the first time in English history, women were allowed to perform on the public stage. The effect was electric. Audiences who had grown up watching boys play female roles were now watching real women play them, and the playwrights responded by writing female characters of unprecedented complexity, intelligence, and desire. But while the court danced and the merchants counted their gold, a shadow was moving through the poorest parishes of the city. In the spring of 1665 it arrived, the Great Plague. It began in the overcrowded, filthy parishes just outside the old city walls, St. Giles and the Fields, where the poorest Londoners lived 10 and 12 to a room. By June it had crossed into the city itself. By August it was killing 1,000 people a week. By September it was killing 7,000 people a week. The symptoms were unmistakable and lethal. First, a burning fever, then the swelling of the lymph nodes, the buboes in the groin and armpits that gave the disease its name, that swelled to the size of an orange and turned black. Death typically followed within 5 days. The wealthy fled. Charles II took his court to Oxford. The lawyers abandoned their chambers. The merchants locked their warehouses and retreated to their country estates. Those who remained in London were those who had nowhere else to go, the poor, the tradespeople, the servants, and those whose duty kept them, the doctors, the clergy, the searchers of the dead, women who were paid to examine corpses and determine the cause of death, a job so dangerous and so low that only the most desperate would take it. The city implemented measures that feel eerily modern. Infected houses were sealed shut with a red cross painted on the door and the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." The inhabitants, the sick and the healthy together, were locked inside for 40 days. Watchmen stood at the door to prevent escape. Dogs and cats, believed to spread the disease, were slaughtered by the tens of thousands. Public gatherings were banned. Theaters closed again. In the course of 18 months, the Great Plague killed approximately 100,000 Londoners, roughly 1 in 4 of the city's population. The death carts that moved through the streets at night, the driver ringing a bell and calling, "Bring out your dead," became the defining image of the era. Mass graves were dug across the city. Some of them were not discovered until construction work in the 20th century accidentally broke through into them. By the winter of 1665, the plague had begun to recede. Slowly, cautiously, the city returned. The king came back. The court reopened. The exchange began trading again. London had survived, though it was hollowed out with grief. It had survived the plague. What it could not survive was what came next. It began in the early hours of the 2nd of September 1666, a Sunday. In a bakery on Pudding Lane, very close to London Bridge, an oven was not properly damped down before the baker and his family went to bed. Sometime after midnight, a spark caught. By the time the household woke, the ground floor was ablaze. The fire spread to the hay and straw stored in the yard of the Star Inn next door. From there, it jumped to the buildings across the street. London's buildings, timber-framed, their upper floors packed closely together, many of them storing combustible goods like oil, tallow, rope, and gunpowder, burned with terrifying speed. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken and brought to see the fire in its early hours. He looked at it, reportedly said a woman could piss it out, and went back to bed. It was one of the most catastrophically wrong assessments in the history of urban governance. By dawn, the fire was advancing on a front nearly a quarter of a mile wide, driven by a fierce east wind. The heat was so intense that St. Paul's Cathedral, built of stone, had its lead roof melting and flowing in rivers down the street. Samuel Pepys, watching from a boat on the Thames, described pigeons hovering over their burning lofts, so reluctant to leave their homes that they waited until their wings caught fire before they fell. The fire burned for 4 days and 3 nights. When it was finally stopped, partly by wind change, partly by the desperate measure of blowing up buildings with gunpowder to create fire breaks, the extent of the destruction was almost incomprehensible. 13,200 houses destroyed, 87 churches burned, including the medieval St. Paul's Cathedral, the Royal Exchange, gutted, the Guildhall, the Great Hall of London's civic government, burned to a shell, the Custom House, the prisons, the markets, gone. Nearly 400 acres of the city, the dense ancient medieval heart of London, reduced to ash and smoldering rubble. In a strange mercy, the official death toll was remarkably low, only 6 deaths recorded, though historians believe many more died uncounted, their remains too consumed by the heat to be found. But the human catastrophe was nonetheless immense. 100,000 people were homeless. They camped in the fields north of the city, in more fields in Islington, in makeshift tents, their entire world reduced to whatever they could carry as they fled the advancing fire. Pepys buried his gold and his Parmesan cheese in the garden. It is somehow the most human detail in all of history. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, London faced a choice, the same choice Lisbon would face 90 years later after its earthquake. Do you rebuild what was lost, or do you build something entirely new? Several architects and thinkers rushed forward with grand plans. Christopher Wren, at this point a 33-year-old professor of astronomy who had only recently turned his extraordinary mind toward architecture, submitted a design for a completely rebuilt London. Wide, rational, grid-like boulevards, piazzas, a new city designed from scratch on Enlightenment principles. It was breathtaking. It never happened. The practicalities of property rights, of merchants desperate to get back to trading, of a city that simply could not wait years for a grand plan to be approved and executed, all of these overwhelmed the visionaries. London was rebuilt on its medieval street plan. The same winding alleys, the same crowded lanes. Pepys's London would be recognizable to someone who had lived in the London of 200 years before. But it was rebuilt in brick and stone, and Wren was given something that partially consoled him for the loss of his grand plan. He was appointed to rebuild the city's churches, 51 of them, and to design a new St. Paul's Cathedral to replace the medieval one consumed by the fire. What Wren produced over the next 40 years was one of the greatest architectural achievements in English history. The new St. Paul's Cathedral, its great dome rising over the rebuilt city, became the defining image of London for the next 3 centuries. The 51 churches he designed, each one different, each one a small masterpiece of proportion and light, transformed the skyline of the city. And because they were built of Portland stone, a pale gray-white limestone from Dorset, the new London looked nothing like the old one. Where the medieval city had been dark and cramped and smelled of rot, the rebuilt city was pale, airy, and geometrically confident. It was, almost despite itself, the first modern London. London in the 1660s is one of the most dramatic decades in the history of any city on Earth. In the space of 10 years, this city experienced the euphoria of a king's return, the intoxication of restoration culture, a plague that killed 1 in 4 of its people, and a fire that erased its medieval heart. It emerged from all of it changed forever, stripped of its medieval skin and forced reluctantly into modernity. The spirit of that decade is still there if you know where to look. It's in the dome of St. Paul's, Wren's defiant answer to catastrophe. It's in the dark paneled coffee houses that survive in the alleys near the Royal Exchange. It's in the diaries of Samuel Pepys, the most honest and vivid account of ordinary life in extraordinary times ever written. A man who watched his city die and be reborn and had the extraordinary discipline to write it all down every night in a cramped private cipher. London in the 1660s reminds us that cities are not buildings. They are people. Stubborn, adaptive, grief-stricken, and irrepressible people who will sleep in a field if they must and be back behind their market stalls by morning. The fire took everything. London rebuilt anyway. That, perhaps, is the oldest and most human story of all. If you found this journey through 17th century London compelling, let us know in the comments which city's hidden history we should bring to life next using our AI lens. Should we walk the canals of Golden Age Amsterdam, or cross the bridges of Mughal Delhi at the height of its power? This is The Dead Historian. We keep history alive. I'll see you in the next era.